And I'm pretty sure that we've talked about most things in 7 and 8, even in state section. Pretty sure we've covered it. But if you'll go to 226, thank you. Oh, you didn't see them? Okay. If they went to get breakfast, I hope they brought us all something. All right, let's get going then. Go to page 226 and 227, and when you see due diligence by the agent, guys, you could get a test question that asks you, what does a listing agent do, or what are the listing agent's responsibility? And then if you'll look at the top of 227, some other things that you would want to do as a listing agent. Wouldn't you want to ask the seller for anything that they have that might assist you in marketing the property? Survey, you know, do you have any nice photographs of the property when it was spring and all the flowers in bloom? You know, certain things like that. Any restrictive covenants, and you're gonna get the square footage of the property. So you're gonna discover a lot. Now, a lot of that you will put on MLS, and a lot of this we need for the listing agreement. But due diligence by the listing broker, I hope all that kind of comes together for you. All righty, let's go back to Unit 9 and 10 in your national part of your exam. Units 9 and 10 would be the sales contract, and you do have 3 questions in the state portion of the sales contract. So let's see if we can get this done, and the rest of the review should go pretty quickly. Offers and counter offers, and written or verbal. Remind yourself that an offer is not a contract. So if you get a question and they ask about offer, read carefully, because it's probably in the negotiating time frame. Even if you see the terminology accepted offer. Remember, we said that mutual agreement is a 3-step process. Mutual agreement is the offer first, the acceptance of the offer second, and then the communication of the offer third. So acceptance of the offer means it was signed with no changes. Everybody remember that? Signed with no changes. And once the offer has been signed, it's called accepted offer. Remember that an accepted offer can be revoked at any time, just like an offer can, as long as it hasn't been communicated that it's been sold, or communicated that it's been accepted. So remember that counter offers we're negotiating, aren't we? The seller may have seen something that they don't like, so they're not going to accept it in the mirror image. They're changing, even if it's one simple thing, it's a rejection of the offer. Once an offer has been rejected, it cannot be rejuvenated, it cannot be recalled, because it's gone. So if a seller counters an offer, we know that they rejected something, and let's say that they don't hear from the other agent and they're wondering, well, what happened to the buyer, and they get nervous and ask their agent to call the other agent, tell them we'll take their original offer. No can do, you rejected it. What you could say is ask them to resubmit, and we know that you're really playing your cards probably not in a good way, because now they're thinking you're feeling a little more desperate perhaps. So when we submit offers to the seller, we really need to explain them thoroughly so they can see before they just make an off-the-cuff decision. I don't imagine they would really selling real estate, but owners do get stuck sometimes on some certain things, and one is the price. And the offer price, yes, it's important, but wouldn't the closing date be important too? Wouldn't the amount of due diligence time be important? Wouldn't the financing the buyer's getting be important too? So those are the things that we should point out to the owner. You're going to have a question about the essential elements to make a contract valid, and that would have to do with your valid, void, voidable and unenforceable as well. So in your reading, that was in Unit 9, it gives you the 4 essentials. And so just to write them down again if you want to. 1, you have to have competent parties. Competent parties means sane and of age. Sane, not declared incompetent. If you get a question and it says one of the parties was declared incompetent, or adjudicated incompetent, that means it's court. The court has stepped in and said this person is incompetent. Guys, the contract would be void. If it's court, it's void. In other words, if you just said, I'm incompetent, that might not be void. It might be voidable, perhaps, who knows, depending on whatever's going on. But if it looks like the courts have said this person is insane or this person is incompetent, it's void. So, competent parties. Next is legal, lawful. Whatever the contract is about has to be lawful. Thirdly is consideration. Consideration means something of value. It doesn't have to be money, although it often is. Something of value is money, action, promise. Money, action, promise. If your parents give you a property, they're giving it to you, so there's not a sales price on it, there's no money on it. But the action of them giving it to you, and we could even say love and affection, is considerable.
Is that put in the contract?
Well, no. And you've got to have mutual agreement. And so we said mutual agreement is offer first, acceptance second, communicate thirdly. Now your questions, your fact scenarios are going to be a little wordy, and so I would draw the net, the line in the sand that we showed on the board. The seller's always on one side and the buyer's always on the other. The buyer is to get the word one way or the other. We're communicating to the buyer that their offer was accepted. If the buyer has an agent, we know they've got a representative standing in their shoes. The buyer's agent would be on their team. If the communication goes to the buyer's agent, it's the same as it went to the buyer. If the buyer does not have an agent, then the buyer's going to have to get the word some way, somehow. And we reviewed it. It can be calling, emailing, faxing, dropping it in the mail. It could be hand delivery, any reasonable manner. So a contract is valid if it meets all those requirements. It's void if it's missing one. It's voidable if it appears like it's valid, but something about it comes up later, like a minor who was in the contract and we didn't question their age. They could come back and say, I want to avoid the terms. That would make it voidable. Voidable means it could go through if nobody says anything. Someone intoxicated could avoid the contract. So unenforceable would be like a verbal contract. Now, we didn't say verbal contracts were illegal. I suspect a lot of people sell with a handshake, and old-timey that was, but maybe even now people are selling handshake on it. The problem is when someone comes back later and says, but I didn't say that. And then you've got an issue of he said, she said, if you will. So verbal is unenforceable. We know when we present offers, we present them at the same time if you have multiple offers. So multiple offers means probably it's a seller's market and you're getting more than one offer at a time. And if you get more than one offer, there's no set order of presentation. You really present them at the same meeting, and you're going to do your estimated net sheet for the seller, the pros and cons of each one, and they're looking at them all at the same time. And then they choose which one, if any, they want. remind yourself they're not gonna counter everyone, because if they counter everyone, they could get response back like that on all three, if there are three, and they'll be under contract 3 times, and they'll be sued. So it would be good to pick one, if one is good enough to counter, or to use the form in a contract form called, a contractual form that's not a contract, called response to the buyer. Remember, it's just a form that the seller can send back and say, thank you for bringing us this offer. We're rejecting it though, and we might consider some of this. It's not a counter, but it's a way to send back to the people, we've seen it and we're rejecting it. And if you've got multiple offers, you might be sending it to multiple people until you get exactly what you want. It's called response to buyer. It's in Unit 10. Alrighty, provision in the contracts and some addenda. Just like in Unit 8 about the provisions in the listing agreement, I really think you must read over your Form 2T. Everyone, I can see questions just pop out to me when I lecture on this. If you read the provisions, it will help you, because now we understand most everything that's written in there. But another way would be to read the narrative that they have in your Unit 10, and that begins on page 302, where they discuss some of the major provisions. But I would read my contract, get right to the source. I really think that would be beneficial. Is there any provision on the contract that you don't understand? If I said to you this is not a condition contract, does that make sense? This is not a condition contract, this 2T. It's a due diligence contract, isn't it? So there's no loan condition, there's no appraisal condition, there's no home inspection condition. It's a due diligence contract, meaning the buyer is in the contract unless they say they don't want to be in. And everybody, the buyer can walk away for any single reason they want to. They can walk during the due diligence frame. And remember that time is negotiated, and there is time is of the essence on that date. And what does that mean? Time is of the essence. It's a specific date. If we don't have it done, if you don't notify that you're terminating by that date at 5 p.m. in writing, by the way, then you're still in the contract. And if you walk away later, you would be in breach, buyer. Now remind me, what would be the seller's remedy? What's the seller's recourse if the buyer breaches? Earnest money. Alrighty, let me give you a question, and I want you to listen carefully. Which of the following would the seller get if the buyer breaches the contract? A, earnest money, B, due diligence fee, C, both, D, neither.
C, both.
Not both,
Oh, is there earnest there?
just the earnest.
Oh.
All right, let me explain the question to you. The question is, what does a seller receive if the buyer breaches? Earnest money is their only remedy for breach. They already got the due diligence fee, if you will, and the due diligence fee was for the time the buyer wanted to decide if they want to stay in. That's a little bit of a tricky question. Yes, they have the due diligence fee. They get to keep it, but it's not for the breach of contract. It's the due diligence fee was something else, is what I'm trying to say. So in your contract where you read about earnest money, it really says specifically, it's the seller's sole and exclusive remedy. That's all they get if the buyer breaches, earnest money deposit. What if the buyer doesn't give earnest money deposit? Then the seller doesn't have anything. So earnest money deposit does have merit, even though it's not a requirement for a valid contract. It does have merit. Alrighty, let's think about the addenda for a minute. The addenda to the contract, an addenda reminds me of the discussion Jane and I were having about the parole evidence rule. The parole evidence rule says the last written word rules. If an addendum, excuse me, is added to the contract, aren't you adding or amending something? So the addendum probably is going to add to or change something in the contract. So on page 309, you've got, well, actually 307, you've got a list of addenda that would be available in the forms library. I would read over what these addenda do because it would be a question you would have, and you would need to know what form to use. So if a buyer is going to get FHA or VA financing, it would be really important to attach that financing addendum. That financing addendum will allow the buyer out of the contract even after its due diligence is over if the property does not appraise for the sales price.
What is that?
The FHA VA addendum. This is on 307. So it would be good for you just to take a sneak peek and read over what these addenda mean. I think lots of it is self-explanatory. Buyer possession before closing, seller possession after. I would remember that those are possession days of only 14 days. It's not meant to be a lease. It's meant to be only 14 days. We know if the property's built before 78, the seller has to sign a base payment addendum or the property manager for a rental, right? Let's go over to page 311, and we've got association addendum. Everyone, the residential property disclosure that most sellers will answer the questions, it does address homeowners association. But there are some properties that are exempt from that, like new construction or a foreclosure sale. If if a builder's selling a new house, they're not required to fill out the questionnaire, the residential property disclosure. If a property is going through an estate or a foreclosure, it's not a requirement on that either. So if they are exempt and the property is in an area with an association, there's an association addendum that would be required for that to get notice about everything about the homeowners association. Who is it with? What are the dues? What do they cover? When are they due? Things like that. We learned about the Vacation Rental Act when we talked about Unit 11, landlord-tenant. So if you were selling property in a vacation area, you would attach that, and it probably has something in there about the pre-established leases have to be honored for the next 6 months, don't they? Y'all remember that? If a vacation rental is sold, oftentimes vacation rentals are pre-booked, booked in advance. And if a buyer buys that vacation rental, they have to honor the next 6 months of bookings, if you will. Backup and short sale, everyone, those are important. If the property is in short sale, the short sale addendum would be important to have. I want you to look at your third line under short sale addendum. I'm on 311. This form allows both parties to terminate under certain circumstances. 311, short sale addendum, third line. This form allows both parties to terminate under certain conditions. Think about it. When short sales were so common, oftentimes a buyer would make an offer on a property. The seller accepts it, everybody, but it's going to be conditional on the bank approving it. Sometimes those contracts would sit on a bank's desk for weeks, months. If you were a buyer waiting around for that, you could say, I'm tired of waiting. You could say, I'm losing marketing or choices. I'm distracted now. Here's a past student of mine. Aren't you cute? I'm good. How are you? reviewing.
Okay, we'll be on.
Okay, come see me again.
Okay.
You smell good.
I know, it's like dog.
Bye. If you're waiting around, you might say, gosh, I'm losing other opportunities by waiting, right? And so the buyer can withdraw, or terminate. And guys, seller can too. Think about this. When an offer comes in on a short sale situation, I don't know if you caught it, I said the seller still owns the property and they can accept it. It turns into a contract with an addendum. If somebody else wants to make an offer, since that is a conditional contract with the addendum, well then they can take another offer and another contract with the addendum. And so all of that would be sent to the lender and they could choose which one they want. And so if they choose one over the other, wouldn't the seller have to terminate one of them? So that's what that means. Backup contract, the buyer can terminate at any time for the one in the backup. So read over that. Contingent sale. Students have trouble with that word contingent. Contingent means conditional. There is a condition. And if it's a contingent sale, it's conditional on me either selling my property or closing it so I can buy the other property. And so that would be an important addendum to attach. Now, when you read over your offer to purchase, it doesn't say it's a requirement to attach it if the buyer has a house to sell, but it would be recommended because it protects the buyer. You know, you might meet somebody who says, I have a house to sell, but I don't have to sell it before I buy. And so they might say, I don't want to do contingency because if it's a seller's market, seller might say, I don't want to take any contingencies because I want to there are buyers out there and I don't want to wait. I don't want to not know. And so if they don't have to sell it in order to buy, then they could choose not to attach it. Alrighty, when we talk about remedies for breach, if someone breaches a contract, it could be seller or buyer, the remedies, most of them are money remedies, aren't they? So the remedies are liquidated damage, compensatory damage, consequential damage, specific performance, and then there is rescission. So if someone breaches the contract, all of those remedies are available to either party. Liquidated damages is a known dollar amount. If you're questioned in a contract, which money would be liquidated damage?
Due diligence.
Earnest money. Well, you know what? I wonder about the due diligence, because it is a known amount, but answer is probably going to be earnest money. Liquidated damage is a known amount of money that both parties negotiated at the beginning, and they know that that's what they're subject to lose. Well, due diligence wouldn't be, because it's for breach. So if it's earnest money, it's a known amount, just like security deposit. If you are a renter and the owner wants security deposit, then you know you're subject to lose that amount if you leave the property damaged above wear and tear. The compensatory is reimburse me for what I spent. So seller breaches a contract and the buyer paid for an appraisal, credit report, inspection. You know, they are out of pocket. And so they could say, reimburse me, seller, for that amount of money, a known amount, because make me whole again. Make me whole as if it never happened. It's not in your reading and you really don't need to write it down, but it's called status quo ante. Get me back to the way it was before. Ante means before, status quo, before. And so it means make me whole again, as if I didn't even spend it. And then the consequential is if the party can prove that the breach was intentional, and I think about it as punitive in a way. You're gonna pay the consequences. We know what specific performance is. Performance is typically it's a buyer suing the seller to sell the property, isn't it? Because why?
There's not another property like it.
There's not another property like it. No other property like it because it's unique. Alrighty, let me see. Options. Guys, remind yourself that an option is a contract. An option comes with an option fee, non-refundable generally. If the buyer were to buy, or the optionee were to opt in, let's say, then the option fee is generally credited to the contract. Just like the due diligence fee would be credited should the buyer stay in a sales contract. Remember, the option has two parties. Optionor is the owner. Optionee is the would-be buyer. He's got the choice of opting in. Remind yourself that an option contract is the opposite of a due diligence contract. A due diligence contract, the buyer is in contract. They're just deciding if they want to leave. An option contract, even though all the terms are established at the beginning, the optionee is deciding if they want to opt in at those terms. So similar but different. Termination of contracts, guys, this is different than termination of agency. If you were asked, does death terminate a sales contract? The answer would be no. If you were asked, does destruction of the property terminate a sales contract? The answer would be no. Could it? Yes. And who would make the decision? Buyer. Guys, so when you go back and read your contract, there's a risk of loss provision. The risk of loss says the risk is the seller's risk. They're supposed to keep insurance on the property. If the property is under contract and the property is destroyed, the buyer has a unilateral right to decide if they want to terminate or do they want to wait and get the insurance proceeds, right? That provision makes me nervous because how do you know the seller has insurance? So you would really want to make sure. I think that would be a good question to ask when you list the property. You know, who's your homeowner's insurance with? You know, just for information, because who knows what could happen. Huh? Hopefully they do, but there's not a law saying you have to, is there? There's not a law saying you have to have homeowner's insurance. Now, if you got a loan, the bank's gonna say, get it. But if you pay cash or don't know anything, you might say, hey, nothing's happened, I've got money in the bank, if something happens, I can take care of it myself. Alrighty, and then your contract formation, remember, offer, did it get accepted, did it get communicated? Guys, you got several questions on that. It says 5, there might actually just be about 4, but you've got to know what mutual agreement is, so you gotta know who's on whose side of the net. You gotta know that communication can be, any means would be email, fax, phone call, mail. Let's look real quick at 9 and 10 in the state section. So you've got a question about the pre-printed contract form. So again, that could be another question about the provision. And so it really will benefit you to read over Form 2T. Now, I understand that's tedious, but now that you understand most everything that's in there, reading over 2T would be good. I'm on the state outline part where you've got 2 questions on, 3 questions on contracts. And then they give you a question, you might get a question about which contract would you use? Which addendum would you use? If you were given the question, someone has a vacant lot to sell, well then a vacant lot contract would be appropriate, wouldn't it? Because it addresses different things that you would have on a property that has fixtures, etc.
Will we get the names or will we have to know the numbers?
You don't have to know the number, Jane, being an instructor as she is herself, she wants to know if we do have to know the number. You know, in most of the questions, they reference the number according to Form 2T, the offer to purchase and contract. They'll tell you what it is, so you don't have to remember the number. The only number that I can think of you have to remember is FHA loan 203B boy. That is the most popular FHA loan because it's a fixed interest rate loan. And so that's in your reading, but it's 203B, and that could be a question somewhere later on. Due diligence. Everybody good on what due diligence is? In the due diligence period, I would want to know what the buyer's doing then. So in your sales contract is telling you on page 277 what the buyer should be looking for. Here are some suggestions that you need to be checking out in your due diligence period. And then, of course, you need to know that the due diligence fee would be a check given to the seller upon contract date. And then that due diligence fee is a credit back to the buyer at closing because they did not terminate. And then remember, I've asked you to write in your notes that we know by now it would be a debit to the seller also because it's kind of like they got pre-proceeds. Everybody good? Credit buyer, debit seller on the closing information. Alrighty, let's go back, if you will, now to units, is it 11 and 12? And let's talk about non-freehold estates. Well, the non-freehold means non-ownership. It means possession. The two that are really close together that are pretty good test question areas, estate for years and an estate from period to period. Remember, an estate for years, number one, does not have to be years. It is, however, a definite time. Like if you go to the beach to rent a beach house, you will sign an agreement for that 1 week, and it's called an estate for years. It ends automatically. The chart you've got in your book will really help, and the difference between these estates is how do they end? And that's the difference. So an estate for years ends automatically on that date. And so this is on page 326 in your book, if you'd like to look at that. The estate for years has a definite ending, does not renew. The estate from period to period does have a beginning and ending initial time frame, but at that ending it automatically renews itself into a period to period. And generally speaking, residential would be month to month. Okay? And then that would have notice involved. If you didn't want it to renew month to month, the notice would be in the rental agreement. The estate at sufferance, remember we said the landlord is suffering because they can't get possession of the property because the renter is holding over and they are not paying rent. They're probably being evicted. And so this would be an estate at sufferance. And we said the estate at will was kind of a friendly situation. Generally no rent, no notice required. Here are the keys to my lake house, go study for the weekend where it's nice and quiet. And you could come back early, there's no ending. I mean, it's just really one of those friendly situations. Duties of a property manager. Guys, most of these questions are in Unit 12, to be real honest with you. The main duty of the property manager is to realize, page 357, preserve the value of the investment while generating the income for the owner and consistent with what the owner wants you to do. So 357, the main responsibility is to preserve the value of the property, generate the income as per the owner's request. Other duties would be renting out the property, making repairs, coming up with, maybe a budget, maybe, you know, depending on what kind of a property it is. Can you think of anything else? They don't make those major decisions. They might, on page 367, come up with an operating budget where they're looking at the projection of income and expenses. You know, that would be important, wouldn't it? Based on your expenses last year, let's kind of look at what's coming up. Because based on your expenses, we might have to look at the rent. How much are we getting for rent? And the property manager will research the market to see what fair market value of rent is. And they'll advertise the property. Property manager also screens the tenant. They look at the application. Now, when they look at the application of the tenant, they can look at credit report. They can look at criminal report. They can look at job verification and income and judgments and things like that. They cannot make their decision on how many children somebody has, because that would be against fair housing, wouldn't it? And they really shouldn't make a decision just because somebody has been arrested or something like that. It's about conviction. And even then, didn't we say in class that even then the property manager probably shouldn't have a blanket policy on just not renting to anybody convicted of a crime, because it could skew into racial discrimination. And so they really probably need to look at each applicant on a case-by-case basis.
Show up in court?
Yeah, they do. They would, that's true. Barry said that they would be the one doing the summary ejectment. They would be the one standing in the owner's shoes to go to court for the eviction. That's true. By the way, that's the only legal way to evict in North Carolina, isn't it? It's called summary ejectment, where the property manager or owner would see the magistrate in small claims court. So looking over the property management agreement, it wouldn't hurt to kind of scan over, peruse some of the major provisions here. And is there any question? Can you think of anything that might come up? You know, you get certain authority. Remember, we talked about you want your property manager to make some decisions, and there is a dollar amount provision. You can make decisions for me up to this amount of money. If the repair or whatever decision you're trying to make exceeds that amount, call me. Because I would imagine most people who have property managers want them to handle all that, most of the small stuff.
What about the profit and loss statement?
That is, let's look at the operating budget. The operating budget is the one on page 367 that you're doing a projection at any time of income. You know, it says probably a year. You're looking at income and expenses over a year's period. And so you're projecting in order to come up with a budget. On the bottom of 368 is the profit and loss statement. And so this is just kind of a snapshot in time of where the business stands. And they're even looking at some of those same formulas that we talked about for potential income, you know, what kind of expenses do you have? And then, remember, this is the one that we added back the principal because of the equity. You're just looking at where is the business right now. I met with my CPA last week, and we went over my P&L. And for the first half of the year, here's where it stands. And so it shows income or revenue, and it might show losses. Bottom line, here's your profit in that time frame. Operating budget is more income and expenses, predicting what you need to get for rent. All righty, Let's go to the next page, financing. You do have a handful of questions, 2 handfuls really, financing. Now personally, I probably wouldn't overthink this section. This section is level 2, so you have to have understanding, but it pretty much is factual, straightforward type of information. Do you agree with that? It's not like an agency or a sales contract kind of a question. It's what kind of loan is this? You know, and knowing the difference in the loans, knowing the differences in the clauses that may be in a note. So let's talk about discount points. We remember, I hope, that it's prepaid interest. If a discount point is charged, it's because the lender is not getting the yield that they expected to get. And so what got discounted was probably the interest rate, so the borrower will have a lower payment. But the lender's gonna make up for that discount by charging a discount point. And that 1 point to them gives them money up front, if you will, which is called yield or profit. So that's why they charge the points. In math, if you had to do a discount point, remember 1 point turns into 1% of the loan amount. We're not gonna do the 1/8 thing. That's just telling you what the point is doing to the rate. 1/8 down, and the lender gets the 1/8, which is profit to them, or yield. Remember that? But I remember it's interest. The clauses in the note, the 2 that confuse students would be the acceleration clause and the alienation clause. Accelerate means speed up, doesn't it? Speed up the due date because you defaulted. If the borrower defaults on the note for any reason, probably most common is not making payment on time, but for any reason, the lender can accelerate the due date. It's due now. Alienation clause is also called due on sale. Remember, that would be the loan assumption clause. Do not transfer this loan without our approval. And we talked about most loans are not assumable anymore without full qualification. Let me say it a different way. FHA and VA loans are still assumable loans, but the person who wants to assume that loan, take it over, would have to fully qualify with the lender. Loan assumptions really seem to be a thing of the past because interest rates have been so low, we don't need to go find somebody else's low interest rate to take over. Conventional loans are not assumable. So if you were asked which loan has the alienation clause, it would be a conventional loan. Conventional loans are the bank loans that are not backed by the government. They're not insured by the government. Like FHA is insured by HUD, isn't it? And VA is guaranteed by the VA. Conventional loans are not governmentally backed. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get an insured conventional loan if you don't put down at least 20%, but the mortgage insurance that the borrower has to pay for is called private mortgage insurance. So the insurance company would be a private entity, not government. Foreclosure, default, and deficiency. I would remind myself what happens in foreclosure. The reason of foreclosure, and this is on page 401, foreclosure happens when the borrower goes into default. I'm sure banks today give a little time, make it up, catch up, but if the borrower goes into default, the lender can pursue foreclosure. Remember that North Carolina is a title theory state, so the foreclosure is called power of sale or non-judicial, non-court. The trustee conducts the auction. There's a redemption period before the sale called equitable redemption, which means the borrower can either catch up on payments, which I think is unusual, or stop the sale by paying everything back they owe the lender, everything. If it goes to auction and is sold, remember the 10-day statutory period that that sale has to sit for 10 days. Waiting really for somebody to upset it. And also waiting that defaulting borrower can come in and pay everything back as well. If that auction sale gets upset by a certain percentage or a certain amount of money, well then the 10-day period will begin again. So the defaulting borrower has time to pay everything back during a statutory redemption period. If the sale does not bring enough money that will cover the lender's losses, well then they can seek what we call a deficiency judgment. They're in the hole. You owe a certain amount of money and we couldn't get it. So they will seek the deficiency judgment against the person who was in default. Short sale, everybody good on a short sale? You know what it is. Owners in hardship, they don't have the money to bring to closing to make up the difference, and they're asking the lien holder, who is the lender, to accept less than what they owe. It doesn't mean they won't get a 1099 because the IRS says the lender has a shortage, so borrower, you must have had a gain. And so by them sort of saying, we'll take less, it's almost like they gave you money, and it's income tax. So 1099 form on that. Loan types, generally the questions are about FHA loans or VA loans or conventional loans. Yes, there are other kinds of loans, the blanket and the package and adjustable rate and reverse mortgage, home equity loan. Those are pretty cut and dry in your reading, pretty straightforward. But the FHA and the VA loans, there's some information on those you probably want to review. Now, I love the chart, comparison chart on 436, VA and FHA. First of all, VA are guaranteed loans. They're guaranteed by the Veterans Administration, and they're for the benefit of veterans or their unmarried widow or widower. It's a benefit from being in the service. So that veteran would have to show their certificate of eligibility to the lender, and then the lender would get a certificate of reasonable value from the appraiser. You know, it's like an appraisal, a VA appraisal letter. These VA loans are guaranteed. There will be a funding fee that would have to be paid up front. It does tell you that the seller can pay closing costs for the buyer. Generally, there's a cap on that of about 6%. The buyer cannot finance the discount points in their loan. Why do you think VA says we're not going to allow you to finance discount points in the loan?
Because that's the interest rate. I mean, and so if you're trying to get more yield, you don't want to finance interest.
Yes. Do y'all hear what she said? Jane said, well, the Veteran Administration says discount points has to do with your interest rate. Yes, technically we call it closing costs, but it's about lowering your rate, and you're paying interest, and why would we allow you to finance that and pay interest on top of interest? Now, closing costs could be added, and on VA loan, those things, I mean on FHA loans, those things could be added to the loan. So VA loans are for veterans or widows or widowers unmarried of veterans. The VA could make 100% loans too, by the way. And it's all going to depend on the borrower, his eligibility, and the guarantee that would come with that for the lender. An FHA loan is insured by the government, and so it would be the principal and interest payment along with the escrow of tax insurance and FHA insurance, called mortgage insurance premium. FHA loans, everyone, do have loan limits. The limit's pretty high though, and it does vary from region to region. I believe the limit around here is around 274 or some kind of a dollar amount like that. It's pretty high. It's high because of this statement. We said that a lot of FHA loans are applied for by first-time buyers. And first-time buyers in the upper 270s sounds high, doesn't it? But a lot of first-time buyers today are double wage earners, and they can afford more than the typical starter home. Anyone can apply for an FHA loan, everybody. You don't have to be a first-time buyer. You don't have to have low income. Even a veteran can use FHA if they want to. Because remember, if a veteran has a loan in their name already, they can't use another VA loan while that loan's in their name.
No discount points on that FHA loan.
No, there could be. They can be financed.
And they can finance the interest on an FHA loan.
But not VA. Almost everything can be financed on the FHA loan. And the seller can pay part of closing costs. And remember, the limit tends to be about 6%. Why do you think there's a limit on how much the seller can contribute to the closing cost? Huh?
Bad things probably happen when they did allow that, they did allow that for higher.
Because the borrower doesn't have much invested.
Yeah, and I think that's what Damien's alluding to too. You know, the bad things can happen, like the buyer can default. If they don't have much to lose, if the seller's paying closing costs and they don't have much down payment, you know, defaulting, not that I'm saying people do it on purpose, but if you've got more at stake, you might try not to, you might work harder. I'm trying to say it gently, and I don't mean it as an offensive statement, but if you don't have much to lose, you might not worry so much.
Sellers can influence that closing big time, like if the buyers can't close at all, and then they might not be a good risk for the bank, and then you're helping them close anyway, which is why they have to disclose those gifts that they get in the thousands, because they'll put it down as income, and it really isn't, knowing good and well your mama helped buy his house.
And you know what, if you get a question about loan fraud, that's the biggest cause of loan fraud is misrepresenting your income because you're trying to borrow more money than what you can qualify for. Conventional loans, let's just finish this little section, everyone. Conventional loans can be insured, meaning you're borrowing more than 80%. You're borrowing more than 80% LTV, loan to value. If you're borrowing more than 80%, there's going to be private mortgage insurance attached to the payment. If you put down at least 20%, then you don't have an insured loan anymore. And not backed by the government. By the way, these three loans we're speaking about, any of these loans you would go to the bank to get. The only one that if you can't find a bank to give a loan is the VA, then the Veterans Administration will lend. If it's in an area where there's not a lender that will lend. The Truth in Lending and Regulation Z zebra, remember that's about the true disclosure of finance cost. It's the credit, the true cost of the credit that needs to be disclosed. And if you're advertising any kind of finance terms, all terms need to be disclosed. In other words, if you say, call about this low interest rate, it's only 3%. Guys, that's a trigger. It's a trigger, it's a penalty. You've only got one thing in regard to financing. If you've got one thing, it means you need to say everything. Now, don't get confused, because I think this could be confusing. What if the ad in the paper says, call about this property, the homeowner's dues are only $100 a month? Is that violating Truth in Lending? And the answer is no, because it's not finance. It's only about finance fees. You can use words like low payments, low interest rate, low closing cost, and there's nothing wrong with that. You will have a question about the loan estimate. Remember, when a buyer goes to apply for a loan, the lender is to give them an estimate of closing cost and the pamphlet about closing costs within 3 days from the application. So that loan estimate needs to go out within 3 business days from the loan application. And as a real estate agent, you need to know these things so you can just remind your buyer, have you gotten that yet? And we said loan fraud, biggest thing is misrepresentation. All righty, you want to take a quick break? And then we'll come back and see if we can finish up.